The Biological Code Podcast, a podcast on Germanische Heilkunde. Today we're talking about bladder infection, or UTI. Juliana had been dealing with recurring bladder infections ever since she was a child. Unfortunately, she no longer remembers the original conflict, but she still remembers well having to take pills again and again. Often they were antibiotics, along with other medications that are no longer on the market today. One day, the pain returned, and in her desperation, she drove to the hospital to have what was known as a bladder infection examined. A brief note on the terms UTI or bladder infection. In Germanische Heilkunde, we know that infections do not exist, that a person cannot become infected by anything. It's the idea that harmful bacteria travel up the urinary tract and cause symptoms. Instead, what is commonly referred to as an infection can, according to Germanische Heilkunde, only be a biological adaptation process of your body. In this case, it is symptoms of the PCL phase, also called the resolution phase. But let's continue. So Juliana went to the hospital. That's when the doctors found actual scarring in the bladder lining. The finding was a thickening of the bladder wall. She was diagnosed with interstitial cystitis. If you look it up, it is described as a chronic, meaning recurring, bladder condition in which no bacteria can be detected. The cause? Unknown. And that's where conventional medicine leaves us. Anyone who knows the 5 biological laws of nature from Germanische Heilkunde can classify this finding differently. In Germanische Heilkunde, a bladder infection is always the healing phase of what is described as a territorial marking conflict. A conflict involving the perception that one's personal boundaries cannot be marked, allowing others to cross them. In the conflict active phase, the bladder lining, meaning the squamous epithelium membrane that covers the bladder, becomes thinner. The biological purpose is to widen the urethra and hold more urine to be able to better mark one's territory. In nature, animals are marking their territory with urine, so that their scent tells other animals that they are entering other territory. We are operating within biology here, and the body helps biologically, not intellectually or psychologically. In any case, Juliana repeatedly suffered from painful, unpleasant symptoms of the bladder. In other words, she constantly experienced a violation of her boundaries and resolved it. Juliana and her husband Yuri created a petting zoo. As they continued taking in more and more animals, it gradually became a place where families would come with their children. There was always activity, always something happening. As Yuri was responsible for taking care of the guests, which he very much enjoyed, and often talked with them for hours, Juliana simply had no time for that. She always had a lot on her plate. The two had agreed that he would take care of the guests, while she would meanwhile take care of the house. Because Juliana kept experiencing these symptoms in her bladder, the two of them discussed what they could do about it. At certain events, Juliana already knew in advance that she would again be in pain the next morning. Yuri suggested shielding her from unexpected guests. He would either quickly warn her so that she could decide whether she wanted to see the person, or he would simply tell visitors that his wife was currently unavailable or not at home. This worked quite well overall, with only a few exceptions that would promptly result in another relapse of the territorial marking conflict. Juliana and Yuri spoke to Dr. Hammer and naturally began to understand the biological connections to Juliana's symptoms. Over the years, they went on to build a guest house, which naturally meant that there were always guests and people around. One morning, it was still very early, and Juliana had just gotten up and gone into the kitchen in her nightgown to make herself a cup of coffee, when she saw a guest approaching the terrace door. The kitchen also served as her living room and had 2 doors. One door led to the terrace and was naturally made of glass, so that you could see both in and out. So Juliana was standing there, in her nightgown, her hair still uncombed, and she definitely did not want to speak to a guest at that moment. Naturally, the guests always had a valid concern. In this case, the man was planning to leave and wanted to settle his bill beforehand. There was also a main entrance to their apartment, but it was much further away, so many guests had no idea it even existed, and simply assumed that the terrace door was the main entrance to the guest house owner's home. In that moment, Juliana was once again on her territorial marking track, highly conflict active, and promptly hid under the table. The guest had now arrived at the terrace door and knocked. Juliana, hiding under the table, couldn't sneak out through the other door either, since it was fully visible from the terrace door. So she stayed where she was and waited. The man knocked again, and then once more. He then opened the door. "Hello?" Juliana was very glad that she was well hidden, since the tablecloth hung down far over the table. The man went back outside, and Juliana could finally crawl out from under the table, go into the bathroom, and get dressed. And all at once, the absurdity and comedy of the entire situation really dawned on her. Juliana had to laugh loudly at herself. What an absurd situation! Here she was, an adult woman hiding under the table because a guest, someone she had invited as a guest house visitor, simply wanted to settle his bill. Of course, she had not yet been dressed, but at that time in the morning, that should rather have been embarrassing for him and not for her. In any case, in that moment, Juliana became fully aware that she was in her own kitchen and that nobody intended to do her any harm. She also remembered Dr. Hammer, by then her good friend, who had once said to her, Juliana, if you can laugh wholeheartedly about your conflict, then it is resolved. And with that perception shift, the tracks also dissolve. Juliana was indeed always able to resolve her territorial marking conflicts or move past them, but she had this track that made her particularly allergic to similar situations. Every case is strictly individual, so you can't simply say, bladder infection? Just laugh about it and everything is resolved. Unfortunately, it is not always that simple. Imagine your own parents or in laws living in the same house and occasionally just walking into your apartment without warning. In some circumstances, you don't just laugh that off. You have to address the situation, confront it, and in that way find a solution. One's own territory is not something to be underestimated, and boundaries are perceived entirely individual by every person. Yuri had no problem at all with having guests in his space. He even liked it when they felt home. But for Juliana, it was a different story. He did his best to support Juliana, but he couldn't resolve the conflict on her behalf. She had to do that herself. And in this case, it wasn't even that difficult. It was enough to become fully aware of the situation with all its absurdity, and voila! She literally had to shake with laughter at herself. Afterwards, she one more time had very mild symptoms following a similar situation. This time, she didn't crawl under the table, but she still briefly slipped onto her old track. Well, old habits die hard. After that, she never experienced a bladder infection again. Do you also recognize such habitual absurd behaviors in yourself? Would you also like to be able to laugh heartily about them? Learn Germanische Heilkunde. Anyone can do it. Learn to think biologically. The knowledge of Germanische Heilkunde belongs in every household. If you'd like to learn how to apply the 5 biological laws in everyday life, visit thebiologyproject.org. You can also find more about our association at urkraftleben.at. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Telegram, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. Until next time.